A ruthless judge humiliates a young black girl in court, certain no one will challenge him. But among the spectators sits a silent force, an older black man, a former civil rights attorney who once walked away from justice. Watching the girl's pain reignites his fire, and he realizes the judge isn't just corrupt. He's a man whose darkest secrets he still holds. The judge thinks he's untouchable, but his past is about to catch up with him. This isn't just about one case. It's a battle for justice, redemption, and the downfall of a man who thought he could get away with anything. Justice is coming, and this time, it won't be denied. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the cramped apartment, casting long shadows across Jada Williams's face. She blinked away the remnants of sleep, her hand automatically reaching for her phone to check the time. 6:30 a.m. The familiar sounds of her mother rushing around the small space filled her ears, the gentle clink of coffee cups, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. Jada turned her head to look at her father, still asleep in the bed across the room. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his face pale against the worn pillowcase, the skin around his eyes dark and sunken. The illness had taken so much from him, his strength, his job, and now potentially their home. The collection of pill bottles on his bedside table stood as silent witnesses to his struggle. "Jada, honey," her mother called softly, adjusting her nurse's uniform and tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Remember to eat something before you go." She moved quickly between the kitchen area and the bathroom, multitasking as she always did, her movements practiced and efficient after years of early morning routines. The eviction notice sat on their small kitchen table like an unwelcome guest, its crisp white paper a stark contrast to the scratched wooden surface. Jada couldn't help but stare at it, the official letterhead and cold legal language making her stomach twist into tight knots. She'd read it so many times she had memorized every word, every threatening clause. "I know, Mom," Jada replied, pushing herself up from her makeshift bed on the couch, the springs creaking beneath her. She padded over to her father's bedside, gently touching his forehead. Still warm, but not as bad as yesterday. His skin felt papery under her fingers. Her mother paused her morning routine, coming to stand beside Jada. The circles under her eyes betrayed another sleepless night. "Baby, I wish I could be there with you today, but..." "You have to work," Jada finished, forcing a smile. "I understand." And she did. Every shift her mother worked was another chance to keep their heads above water, another small defense against the mounting bills that threatened to drown them. "You're stronger than you know," her mother whispered, pulling her into a tight hug. The familiar scent of her mother's coconut shampoo was comforting, mixing with the antiseptic smell that always clung to her uniform. "You can do this, we believe in you." After her mother left for work, the click of the door lock echoing in the quiet apartment, Jada opened the closet where the borrowed suit hung. Mrs. Johnson from next door had lent it to her daughter's old interview suit. The navy blue material was clean but clearly worn, with subtle shine at the elbows and knees. And when Jada slipped it on, the shoulders hung too loose, the sleeves too long. She rolled the sleeves carefully, trying to make the suit look more presentable, smoothing out the wrinkles with trembling hands. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection showed a girl playing dress-up, but her eyes held something different: determination, fear, hope, all mixed together in a gaze too mature for her years. Her father stirred as she was fixing her hair, trying to tame it into a neat bun like she'd seen on TV lawyers. "Jada?" His voice was rough with sleep and illness. "I'm here, Dad." She moved to his side, taking his thin hand in hers, careful not to disturb the IV line. "You look beautiful," he managed, though it clearly took effort to speak, each word a struggle against his weakened state. "Just like your mother, when she was young." Tears threatened to spill, but Jada held them back, not wanting to ruin her carefully applied mascara. "Save your strength, Dad. I've got this today." The walk to the courthouse seemed both too long and too short, each step echoing on the morning sidewalk. Each step brought her closer to a moment she'd been dreading for weeks. The morning air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of car exhaust and early morning coffee shops, and she clutched her folder of documents close to her chest. Medical bills, payment records, everything they had to prove they deserved a chance, that their lives couldn't be reduced to a series of missed payments. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone steps leading up to heavy wooden doors, its windows reflecting the morning light like judgmental eyes. Other people rushed past her, lawyers in expensive suits with leather briefcases, court officials with badges clipped to their belts, people clutching papers just like her, their faces showing the same mix of anxiety and hope. Jada's heart pounded against her ribs as she stood at the bottom of the steps, the borrowed shoes pinching her toes. She thought of her father's tired smile, her mother's early morning hugs, their tiny apartment that held all their memories, birthday celebrations around the kitchen table, movie nights huddled on the worn couch, quiet conversations through difficult nights. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her borrowed suit jacket and gripped her folder tighter. Her palms were sweaty, but her resolve was firm. This was their only chance, and she wouldn't, let her family down. The courthouse doors waited ahead, ready to open into a world she'd never experienced before, a world of legal terms and procedures she'd only seen on television. Jada took one final steadying breath, squared her shoulders, and placed her foot on the first step. Jada's footsteps echoed through the marble hallway as she entered courtroom 3B. The room felt massive and cold, with its high ceilings and dark wooden panels. Row after row of empty benches stretched before her, making her feel even smaller than she already did in her oversized borrowed suit. The musty smell of old wood and leather filled her nostrils, reminding her of a museum she'd once visited on a school field trip. The court clerk sat behind a large desk, shuffling papers without looking up. Her long acrylic nails clicked against the keyboard as she typed. Jada cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, I'm here for the Williams eviction case." The clerk barely glanced at her, pointing to the defendant's table with a lazy wave of her manicured hand. "Take your seat. Court will begin shortly." Her voice held the bored tone of someone who'd repeated the same phrase 1,000 times. Jada's legs felt wobbly as she made her way to the table. The surface was smooth and polished, but her sweaty palms left marks when she steadied herself against it. She pulled out the heavy wooden chair, wincing at the screech it made against the floor. Her heart thumped so loud she was sure everyone could hear it, the sound seeming to bounce off the imposing walls around her. The courtroom remained quiet except for the occasional shuffle of papers and click of computer keys. A wall clock ticked away the seconds with mechanical precision. Jada pulled out her carefully prepared notes, smoothing the wrinkled pages with trembling hands. She thought of her father lying sick at home, his encouraging smile this morning despite his pain, of her mother working extra shifts to keep food on the table. The weight of their future pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom, making Jada jump slightly in her seat. Judge Walter Pembroke swept in, his black robes billowing behind him like dark wings. His face was lined with age, his white hair perfectly combed, and his expression stern and disinterested. A gold watch glinted on his wrist as he adjusted his papers. He settled into his chair like a king taking his throne, barely acknowledging the room before him. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying authority that made Jada's spine straighten automatically. The wooden chair creaked beneath her as she sat. The judge peered down at his docket, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Williams' eviction case," he muttered, then looked up, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Jada. His eyebrows rose slightly and his mouth twisted into what looked like a smirk. A small vein pulsed at his temple. "You're the defendant?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. His fingers drummed impatiently on the bench. Jada stood, willing her voice not to shake. Her borrowed jacket sleeve slipped down, and she pushed it back quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm Jada Williams, and I'm here to—" "Speak up, girl," Judge Pembroke interrupted sharply. "This isn't your neighborhood playground." His words carried across the courtroom like a whip crack. Heat rushed to Jada's cheeks, but she lifted her chin and started again, her fingernails digging into her palms. "Your Honor, I have evidence that our landlord—" Let me guess. The judge cut her off again, leaning back in his chair with an audible creak. Another typical project kid thinking she can play lawyer. He shook his head, looking around the courtroom as if sharing a private joke. Did you even bother to file the proper responses to this eviction notice? Yes, sir, Jada said, her voice stronger now despite the trembling in her hands. A drop of sweat trickled down her back. I have all the documentation here, including proof of… Documentation? Judge Pembroke scoffed, removing his glasses and polishing them with a white handkerchief. Did you get that from some website? Or maybe one of those community centers that think they can teach legal procedure between basketball games? The judge's words felt like physical blows, each one chipping away at her confidence. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter, more harsh. But Jada thought of her father's proud smile when she told him she would handle this, of her mother's tight hug this morning, the lingering scent of her lavender perfume still present. She couldn't let them down. Your Honor, if you'll just look at the evidence… Young lady, Judge Pembroke's voice turned ice cold, his face hardening like granite. I've been presiding over cases since before you were born. I don't need someone like you telling me how to run my courtroom. The words "someone like you" hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jada's throat tightened, but she kept her head high, even as she felt the sting of tears threatening to form. Her fingernails left small crescent marks in her palms. The judge's dismissal was clear in every line of his face, every sharp word he spoke, every contemptuous glance. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Jada stood before Judge Pembroke, her hands trembling slightly as she held her carefully prepared evidence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the courtroom. The recycled air felt thick and suffocating in her lungs as she tried to steady her racing heart. She took a deep breath and began speaking in the clearest voice she could muster. Your Honor, I have documentation showing our rent payments were always on time until my father's illness. Miss Williams, Judge Pembroke cut in, his voice dripping with contempt. His weathered face twisted into a familiar sneer she'd seen him direct at others like her. I've heard enough of your amateur attempts at legal argument. He leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes cold and dismissive beneath his bushy eyebrows. This isn't some school presentation. This is a court of law. Jada's chest tightened, but she pressed on, gripping the papers until her knuckles turned white. Sir, if you'll just look at these medical bills. What part of I've heard enough escapes your understanding? Pembroke's voice boomed through the courtroom, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. This is exactly what I'd expect from a typical project kid trying to play lawyer. The words hit Jada like a physical blow, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks as scattered whispers rippled through the courtroom. Some of the court staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces pinched with discomfort, while others stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. A court reporter's fingers hesitated over her keyboard before continuing their steady rhythm. Case dismissed, Pembroke declared, bringing down his gavel with unnecessary force that made Jada flinch. Perhaps this will teach you to leave legal matters to actual professionals. Jada stood frozen, her hands still clutching her evidence, the papers crinkling softly under her tight grip. The papers she'd spent hours organizing, highlighting and annotating at her kitchen table late into the night suddenly felt worthless. Her throat burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Not in front of anyone. The courtroom remained eerily silent as she gathered her things, stuffing papers into her worn briefcase with trembling fingers. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with indifference, and a few with the same contempt as the judge. Each step away from the bench felt heavier than the last, her borrowed suit now feeling like it was made of lead, the jacket slightly too big at the shoulders where it had fit her cousin perfectly. As she walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoed against the marble floor, the sound bouncing off the high ceiling. The sound seemed to mock her, each step a reminder of her failure, of her presumption in thinking she could challenge someone like Pembroke. She thought of her father, sick in bed, probably still waiting anxiously for news, and her mother, working double shifts at the hospital, believing her daughter could make a difference. They had trusted her, believed in her, and she had let them down. The anger came in waves, hot and fierce, mixing with the shame and despair that threatened to overwhelm her. But Jada kept her head high, her back straight, even as her heart crumbled inside her chest. She wouldn't give Pembroke the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wouldn't become another story for him to tell at his country club. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, the brass handles cool against her palms, stepping into the hallway. The bustling sounds of the courthouse surrounded her, lawyers chatting about lunch plans, phones ringing in distant offices, footsteps echoing off marble, but she felt completely alone in the crowd. The weight of defeat pressed down on her shoulders, making each step toward the exit feel like walking through deep water. The morning sun still streamed through the courthouse windows, just as bright as when she had entered with hope in her heart. But now it felt like it was shining on a different world entirely, one where justice was just a word in a dusty law book, and people like her family didn't matter to people like Judge Pembroke. One where dreams of fairness shattered against the hard reality of prejudice and power. Jada's footsteps echoed through the marble hallway as she walked away from courtroom 3B, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her borrowed suit jacket, too big for her frame, seemed to swallow her whole, the sleeves hanging past her wrists like a child playing dress-up. The thought of facing her mother, of explaining how she'd failed to save their home, made her stomach clench painfully. She could already picture the defeated look in her mother's eyes, the same look she'd worn when the eviction notice first arrived. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. The fluorescent lights above felt too bright, too harsh, making her head pound with each heartbeat. How could she tell her father, already weak from illness, that they'd lost everything? The image of him lying in his hospital bed, trying to smile through his pain, made her chest ache. Just as she reached for the heavy wooden doors leading out of the courthouse, her fingers barely brushing the worn brass handle, a strong, clear voice rang out behind her. "Your Honor, I have something to say about what just happened in this courtroom." Jada turned, along with everyone else in the hallway, to see an elderly black woman rising from the back row. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite her age, she stood tall and commanding in her perfectly pressed navy blue suit. Her eyes blazed with determination and dignity. "Ma'am, this proceeding is over," Judge Pembroke said sharply, his tone dripping with condescension. But the woman was already striding toward the bench with purposeful steps. "I'm Olivia Morgan, retired civil rights attorney, and I witnessed every moment of your disgraceful conduct today." Her voice carried through the now silent courtroom like thunder before a storm. "You didn't even pretend to give this young woman a fair hearing. Instead, you chose to mock and belittle her, treating her with contempt from the moment she walked in." Judge Pembroke's face reddened, the color creeping up from his starched collar. "Ms. Morgan, you are out of order." "No, Your Honor." Olivia's voice cut through his protest like a knife through butter, sharp and precise. "You are out of order. Your behavior today was nothing short of judicial misconduct. Your prejudice was on full display for everyone in this courtroom to see, as clear as that robe you're wearing." Jada stood frozen by the doors, watching in amazement as this stranger defended her. Olivia Morgan's words rang with decades of experience and righteous anger, each sentence carrying the weight of countless battles fought in courtrooms just like this one. "I've spent 40 years fighting against exactly this kind of discrimination in our courts," Olivia continued, her eyes locked on Pembroke's increasingly uncomfortable face. Her voice never wavered, steady as a heartbeat. "And I won't stand by while you abuse your position to crush this young woman's spirit. Not today. Not ever." The courtroom remained deathly quiet, the silence heavy with tension. Even the court clerk had stopped shuffling papers to watch the scene unfold, her hands frozen mid-motion over her desk. "Furthermore," Olivia announced, reaching into her leather purse with deliberate movements, "I'm prepared to pay Miss Williams's fees myself." She pulled out her checkbook, the sound of its opening somehow loud in the hushed room. "And I suggest you reconsider your ruling, unless you'd like your conduct today to be reviewed by the Judicial Ethics Committee. I still have quite a few friends there." Judge Pembroke's face had gone from red to purple, like a thundercloud about to burst. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking for the first time like he didn't know what to say. His hands gripped the edge of his bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. Olivia turned away from the bench and walked directly to Jada, who still stood by the doors, rooted to the spot. Her stern expression softened like snow melting in spring as she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small white card, crisp and professional. "Here," she said quietly, holding it out to Jada with gentle determination. "You're not alone in this fight. You never were." Jada's trembling fingers took the business card, staring at it in disbelief as if it might disappear at any moment. For the first time since walking into the courthouse that morning, she felt something other than despair. It was small, but it was there, a tiny spark of hope flickering to life in her chest like a candle flame in the darkness. Jada stepped out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, her fingers clutching Olivia's business card so tightly it started to crease. The crisp white card read, "Olivia Morgan, Civil Rights Attorney, Retired," in elegant black letters. Her heart was still racing from everything that had happened in that courtroom, and her legs felt shaky beneath her. The world around her continued as if nothing had changed. Cars honked in the distance, people rushed past on their phones, pigeons pecked at discarded hot dog buns. A street vendor called out prices for pretzels and hot dogs, but inside Jada felt completely different, like someone had rearranged all her pieces and put them back together in a new way. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about Olivia's powerful presence in that courtroom. The way she had stood up to Judge Pembroke, her voice steady and strong as steel, her chin lifted with dignity. Every time Jada closed her eyes, she saw that moment replay. How Olivia had called out the judge's prejudice without fear, how the entire courtroom had fallen silent, how even the court reporter's fingers had frozen over her keyboard. After 3 days of gathering her courage, pacing her bedroom floor and rehearsing what she would say, Jada finally dialed the number on the card. Her hands shook as she pressed each number, and she had to start over twice. When Olivia answered, her warm voice immediately put Jada at ease, like a favorite aunt's embrace. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near the courthouse, a cozy place Jada had passed dozens of times but never entered. The bell above the door chimed as Jada entered the coffee shop, releasing the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods. Olivia was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her silver hair neatly styled and her posture perfectly straight. A ray of sunlight from the window caught her pearl earrings. She smiled warmly and gestured for Jada to join her. "I ordered you some hot chocolate," Olivia said, pushing a steaming mug across the table. Whipped cream topped it perfectly, dusted with cocoa powder. "Seemed like you could use something sweet." Jada wrapped her hands around the warm mug, finding comfort in its heat. Her fingers were still cold from nervousness. "Thank you, Ms. Morgan, for everything." "Call me Olivia," she said, her eyes kind but determined. A familiar fire burned behind them. "Now, tell me everything about your case. Don't leave anything out." For the next hour, Jada poured out her story, her father's illness, the mounting medical bills that arrived like clockwork, the landlord's harassment, and finally, Judge Pembroke's cruel dismissal. Her voice cracked when she described how he had mocked her in front of everyone, his words cutting deeper than any knife. Olivia listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. Her experienced eyes caught every detail, every tremor in Jada's voice. When Jada finished, Olivia leaned forward, her bracelets quietly clinking against the table. "What happened to you in that courtroom was wrong, plain and simple. But you're not alone anymore." "I don't know what to do next," Jada admitted, her voice small, almost lost in the coffee shop's gentle bustle. "We fight," Olivia said firmly, conviction ringing in every word. "I'll cover your legal fees. We'll file an appeal, and this time, you'll have proper representation. The road ahead won't be easy. Fighting for justice never is. But it's worth every step, every setback, every tear." Tears welled up in Jada's eyes, blurring the coffee shop's warm lights. "Why are you helping me?" "Because 40 years ago, someone helped me when I needed it most," Olivia replied, reaching across the table to squeeze Jada's hand. Her grip was warm and sure. "And because I see something special in you, the same fire I had when I started fighting for civil rights. That fire that refuses to let injustice win. As they finished their drinks, Olivia outlined their next steps with the precision of someone who had walked this path many times before. She would connect Jada with a current practicing attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. They would document everything that happened with Judge Pembroke and file formal complaints. Each word built a foundation of hope beneath Jada's feet. When Jada stood to leave, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. The hot chocolate had warmed her from the inside out, but Olivia's support warmed her even more. For the first time since receiving that eviction notice, she felt like she had a real chance. Olivia's words echoed in her mind. She wasn't alone anymore. And sometimes, that made all the difference. Jada pushed open the door to her family's small apartment, the familiar creak of hinges filling the quiet space. The borrowed suit felt heavy on her shoulders, a reminder of everything that had happened in court. Her mother stood by the kitchen counter, still in her work uniform, her eyes full of hope and worry. "Baby, how did it go?" her mother asked, reaching out to touch Jada's arm. Jada's throat tightened. She looked down at her scuffed shoes, trying to find the right words. "Mama, Her voice cracked. "The judge, he wouldn't even listen to me." Her mother's face fell, but she pulled Jada into a tight hug. "Tell me everything, baby." They sat at their small kitchen table where Jada recounted Judge Pembroke's cruel dismissal, his racist remarks, and how he had humiliated her in front of everyone. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke, but her mother held her hand firmly. "We'll figure something out," her mother whispered, squeezing her hand. "We always do. Together." But even as the words of comfort washed over her, Jada couldn't stop thinking about Olivia Morgan. She pulled out the slightly creased business card from her pocket, running her thumb over the embossed letters. Over the next few days, while helping her father with his medication and watching her mother work double shifts, Jada kept returning to the moment Olivia had stood up in that courtroom. The memory of her strong, unwavering voice gave Jada strength. Finally gathering her courage, Jada called the number on the card. Olivia's warm voice answered, and they arranged to meet at a small cafe near the courthouse. "Judge Pembroke has a history," Olivia explained, spreading out several manila folders across the table. "You're not the first person he's treated this way, and I've been keeping track." Jada leaned forward, looking at the documents, case after case where Pembroke had dismissed black plaintiffs without proper consideration. Her heart raced as Olivia explained how they could challenge his conduct. "I've already reached out to some colleagues," Olivia continued, her eyes sparkling with determination. "We're building a case against him. Your experience could be the key to exposing his prejudice and finally holding him accountable." That night, Jada sat cross-legged on her bed, holding Olivia's card under her small bedside lamp. The sounds of the city filtered through her window: car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway. She traced the letters on the card with her finger, feeling something she hadn't felt in the courtroom: hope. The challenges ahead seemed enormous, but she wasn't facing them alone anymore. She had Olivia, a woman who had fought these battles before and won. Maybe, just maybe, they could make things right. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jada's bedroom floor as she pulled on her school uniform. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her shirt, her mind replaying yesterday's courtroom drama. Through the thin walls, she could hear her father's labored breathing from the next room. The walk to school felt longer than usual. Each step brought a new worry, a fresh doubt. As she approached the school building, her stomach tightened. Groups of students huddled near the entrance, their whispers following her like a shadow. "Hey, look who thinks she's a lawyer now," someone called out. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Jada kept walking, chin up, though her heart pounded against her ribs. In first period, a crumpled note landed on her desk. She didn't need to open it to know what it said, probably another taunt about being a project kid. During lunch, she sat alone, pushing food around her plate. Two girls at the next table didn't bother lowering their voices. "Can you believe she actually thought she could take on a judge? What a joke." "Typical project kid thinking she's better than she is," the other replied. Jada's hands clenched into fists under the table. The words stung, echoing Judge Pembroke's cruel dismissal. She wanted to shout back, to defend herself, but she remembered her mother's words about choosing battles wisely. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. In history class, Jada could barely focus on the lesson about civil rights movements. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. A message from Olivia. "You're not alone. I'm with you." 5 simple words, but they hit her like a wave of warmth. Jada sat straighter in her chair, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The taunts suddenly seemed smaller, less important. After the final bell, Jada found a quiet spot in the school courtyard. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed Olivia's number. "Hello, Jada." Olivia's warm voice came through clearly. "How are you holding up?" "It's been rough," Jada admitted. "Everyone at school seems to think I'm crazy for even trying." "Let me tell you something about justice," Olivia said. "It's never been won by people who gave up when others laughed at them. We've already started looking into Pembroke's previous cases. There's a pattern there, Jada. You're not alone in this fight." They talked about next steps, about documentation and testimonies. Olivia's words were like a roadmap through the darkness, showing Jada that there was a way forward, even if it wasn't easy to see right now. "Keep your head up," Olivia said before hanging up. "And remember, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about moving forward anyway." Walking home that evening, Jada felt different. The weight of the day's taunts still lingered, but it no longer felt crushing. Each step felt more purposeful than the last. She might be the target of ridicule now, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. Not when she had someone like Olivia in her corner. Jada's phone buzzed on a Tuesday afternoon as she finished her homework. Seeing Olivia's name flash across the screen made her heart skip a beat. "Jada, we've found something," Olivia's voice crackled through the speaker. "My colleagues and I have been digging into Pembroke's past rulings. The pattern we're seeing, it's worse than we thought." Jada sat up straighter, clutching the phone tighter. "What did you find?" "Over the past decade, Pembroke has dismissed nearly 80% of cases brought by Black plaintiffs. The numbers don't lie, dear. We've uncovered dozens of cases just like yours. Families facing eviction, small business owners fighting foreclosure, all of them treated with the same contempt you experienced." Warmth spread through Jada's chest as she listened to Olivia detail their findings. This wasn't just about her family anymore. Each case represented another person who'd faced Pembroke's prejudice, another dream crushed under the weight of his bias. "Can I help?" Jada asked, her voice steady with determination. "Actually, yes. We need help organizing the case files and identifying patterns. Would you be willing to come by my office after school?" Over the next few days, Jada spent hours at Olivia's office, poring over court transcripts and case files. Her fingers traced similar stories, dismissive comments, rushed judgments, clear bias written between the lines of official documents. One evening, as she walked through her apartment door, her mother looked up from stirring a pot of soup. The familiar worry lines on her face softened when she saw the light in Jada's eyes. "Mama, you won't believe what we found," Jada said, dropping her backpack. She pulled out copies of court records, spreading them across their small kitchen table. "Look at all these cases, all these families. Pembroke did the same thing to them that he did to us." Her mother's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "All of them?" "Yes, but now we have proof. Olivia says we can use this to file a formal complaint. We might even be able to get his previous rulings reviewed." For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, her mother smiled. Really smiled. Maybe something good can come from all this after all. Back at Olivia's office the next day, Jada helped organize evidence into clear categories. They created timelines, documented patterns, and built what Olivia called their case for justice. "You see this?" Olivia pointed to a particularly egregious case from 3 years ago. "This family had all their paperwork in order, just like you did, but Pembroke wouldn't even look at their evidence." Jada nodded, her jaw set with determination. How many more families lost their homes because of him? "Too many," Olivia replied, placing a gentle hand on Jada's shoulder. "But that's why this work is so important. We're not just fighting for your family anymore. We're fighting for everyone who's been silenced by prejudice in that courtroom." As they sat surrounded by stacks of evidence, Jada felt the full weight of what they were undertaking. Each document represented a family's struggle, a dream deferred, a justice denied. But now, with Olivia's guidance and their growing evidence, they had a chance to make things right, not just for her family, but for everyone who'd faced Pembroke's bias. The morning sun cast long shadows across the school hallway as Jada made her way to first period. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, weighted down not just with books, but with the responsibility of the growing legal battle against Judge Pembroke. "Look who it is, the wannabe lawyer," someone whispered loudly as she passed. Snickers followed, echoing off the lockers. Jada kept walking, chin up, though her heart hammered in her chest. The whispers had started the moment she stepped into school. Everyone knew about her court appearance. News traveled fast in their small community. In her English class, she could feel eyes on her back as she took her seat. Madison, a girl who used to be friendly with her, leaned over to her friend. "I heard she tried to act like a real attorney. What a joke." "She's just a project kid playing dress-up," another classmate added, loud enough for Jada to hear. Jada's hands trembled slightly as she opened her textbook, but she refused to show how much their words hurt. She thought of Olivia's strength in the courtroom, how she'd stood up to Judge Pembroke without flinching. That's the kind of courage she needed now. During lunch, she sat alone, using the time to review some of the case notes Olivia had shared. The isolation was hard, but it gave her time to focus on what really mattered. At home that evening, her mother noticed her quiet mood. "Baby, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside Jada on their worn couch. "The kids at school, they think I'm stupid for fighting this battle," Jada admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You listen to me, Jada Williams. Those kids don't know what it means to stand up for what's right. You're fighting for our home, for justice. That takes real courage." From his bed in the corner of the living room, her father's weak voice carried across the room. "Your mother's right, baby girl. You're stronger than all of them put together." Over the next few days, Jada developed a routine. She'd arrive at school early to avoid the morning crowd, use lunch periods to study both her schoolwork and the case materials, and try to tune out the whispers and stares. Some days were harder than others, but she refused to let their mockery derail her. "Heard your case got thrown out," a boy in her math class taunted. "Should have known better than to go up against a judge." Jada took a deep breath, remembering Olivia's words about standing tall in the face of adversity. The ridicule stung, but it also fueled her determination. Every snide comment, every dismissive laugh, they all reminded her why this fight was so important. In the quiet moments between classes, she'd think about all the families like hers who had faced Judge Pembroke's prejudice. The growing evidence of his bias made her more certain than ever that she was doing the right thing, no matter what her classmates thought. Her mother noticed the change in her, how she carried herself with more purpose despite the difficulties. "You're not just my daughter anymore," she said one evening, smoothing Jada's hair. "You're becoming a warrior for justice." From his bed, her father managed a proud smile. Though his illness kept him bedridden, his eyes shone with pride whenever Jada shared updates about the case. The morning sun barely filtered through Jada's window when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Olivia's name on the screen. Usually, calls from her mentor brought hope, but something felt different this time. "Hello?" Jada's voice was tentative. "Jada, dear." Olivia's tone was measured, careful. "I need you to stay calm when I tell you this. Judge Pembroke's office has released a statement to the media about you." Jada's fingers tightened around her phone as Olivia explained. The judge's words were cruel, painting her as a manipulative teenager using an elderly woman for her own gain. Each accusation felt like a physical blow. "He's calling me desperate?" Jada's voice cracked. "And calculated," Olivia confirmed softly. "But remember, this is what people like him do when they're scared. They try to destroy what threatens them." Jada opened her laptop with trembling hands. Headlines already flooded her screen. "Teen accused of manipulating civil rights attorney. Judge Pembroke speaks out against false accusations." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. At school, the situation was even worse. Walking through the hallways felt like moving through a minefield of whispers and pointed fingers. Her classmates, who had already been mocking her, now had fresh ammunition. "Hey, look who it is, the desperate manipulator," someone called out as she passed. "Guess you're not such a hero after all," another voice added. During lunch, Jada sat alone, her phone constantly buzzing with notifications about new articles. Each one seemed to twist her story further, making her look worse. The cafeteria felt suffocating, filled with stares and snickers. She retreated to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall. Her hands shook as she dialed Olivia's number. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she whispered into the phone. "Everyone believes him." "Listen to me carefully, Jada." Olivia's voice was firm but gentle. "This is exactly what Pembroke wants. He's trying to break you because he knows you're a threat. These tactics, they're as old as injustice itself. But the things they're saying about me are lies," Olivia cut in. "And lies can't stand forever against the truth. Remember why we started this fight? It wasn't for popularity or praise. It was for justice." Jada wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. "How do you stay so strong?" "Because I've seen this before, dear. Every time we get close to exposing the truth, they try to discredit us. But we're still here, still fighting. That's what scares them most." The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Jada stood up straighter, Olivia's words echoing in her mind. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "We keep gathering evidence, we keep building our case. Let Pembroke waste his energy on smear campaigns, we'll focus on the truth." Back in the hallway, the whispers continued, but Jada held her head higher. Each mocking comment still stung, but she refused to let them see her cry. She thought of her family, of all the other families who had faced Pembroke's prejudice. Their stories mattered more than any headline. In her room that evening, Jada read through the articles one more time, her hands clenched into fists as she absorbed Pembroke's accusations. The pain was still there, but something else burned brighter: determination. She picked up her phone and dialed Olivia's number. It was time to fight back. The evening sun cast long shadows through Jada's bedroom window when her phone rang. Seeing Olivia's name brought immediate comfort, like a warm blanket on a cold night. "How are you holding up, dear?" Olivia's voice carried the gentle strength that Jada had come to rely on. "It's hard," Jada admitted, her voice catching. "Everyone at school saw the articles, the things they're saying about me." "Listen to me carefully," Olivia said, her tone firm but kind. "I've been exactly where you are. Back in '73, I took on a case against a powerful real estate developer. They tried to destroy my reputation too, called me every name in the book. But you know what? I'm still here, still fighting." Jada sat up straighter, drawing strength from Olivia's words. "How did you handle it?" "I remembered what my grandmother told me. Truth doesn't shout, it whispers, but it never stops whispering." Olivia paused. "This fight isn't just about you anymore, Jada. It's about every person who's been silenced by people like Pembroke." Over the next few days, Jada met with Olivia regularly in her small office downtown. The space smelled of old books and coffee, and somehow that made Jada feel safe. Olivia taught her how to hold her head high when passing whispering classmates, how to focus on gathering evidence instead of reading hurtful comments. "Channel that anger into action," Olivia advised during one of their meetings, spreading out documents across her desk. "Every time someone tries to tear you down, use that energy to dig deeper into Pembroke's past cases." Together, they developed a strategy. Olivia showed Jada how to document everything, how to build a case that would be impossible to ignore. She taught Jada breathing exercises for when the pressure felt too heavy, and reminded her to take breaks when needed. "The truth takes time to surface," Olivia would say, her eyes twinkling with wisdom earned through years of similar battles. "But it always does, just like cream rising to the top." Walking through the city streets after another strategy session, Jada felt different. The weight of her case still pressed down on her shoulders, but it no longer felt like it might crush her. Olivia's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that she wasn't just fighting for her family's apartment anymore. She was fighting for something much bigger, for justice itself. She stopped at a crosswalk, watching the flow of city life around her. The same streets that had once felt so intimidating now felt like the backdrop to something important, something meaningful. Olivia's lessons had changed how she saw everything, not just the legal battle, but herself. Jada sat at her small desk, her laptop screen glowing with yet another news article about her case. The headlines made her stomach churn. Teen troublemaker takes on judge. Local girl's misguided crusade. Judge Pembroke stands firm against false accusations. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. Some called her entitled. Others labeled her a troublemaker. The words stung, but something inside her hardened with each cruel remark. "Enough," she whispered, pushing back from her desk. She grabbed her phone and dialed Olivia's number. "I want to fight back," Jada said as soon as Olivia answered. "I'm tired of letting them control the story." "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," Olivia replied. "I have a list of reporters who might be interested in hearing your side." Over the next few hours, Jada and Olivia crafted emails to several journalists known for their coverage of civil rights issues. They focused on Maria Rodriguez from the City Times and James Turner from Civil Rights Today, reporters with track records of exposing systemic injustice. "Remember," Olivia advised, "speak your truth clearly. Don't let anger drive your words. Let the facts speak for themselves." By evening, responses started trickling in. Maria Rodriguez wanted to meet for an interview. James Turner requested court documents and evidence of Pembroke's conduct. 3 other reporters expressed interest in covering the story. The next morning, Jada met with Maria at a small coffee shop. The reporter listened intently as Jada described her experience in Pembroke's courtroom, taking detailed notes. "This isn't just about my family's eviction anymore," Jada explained, her voice steady. "It's about every person who's been dismissed and degraded by Judge Pembroke because of their race or background." As days passed, more stories emerged. Other families came forward with similar experiences in Pembroke's courtroom. Legal experts began questioning his conduct. Civil rights organizations started expressing support for Jada's cause. A week later, Jada watched herself on the evening news. The segment was fair, presenting her as articulate and determined, rather than naive or manipulative. They showed clips of other victims of Pembroke's prejudice, building a compelling case against the judge's conduct. Sitting in her living room, Jada read Olivia's text message again. "You're the voice they've been waiting for." For the first time since this all began, she felt truly powerful. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Olivia's office as Jada leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents spread across the mahogany desk. Her heart raced as she read through case after case, clear evidence of Judge Pembroke's discriminatory rulings. "Look at this pattern," Olivia said, her finger tracing along a timeline she'd created. "In the last 5 years, Pembroke ruled against Black plaintiffs in housing cases 87% of the time. When the plaintiffs were white, that number drops to 23%. Jada's hands shook as she picked up another file. "And here he used almost the exact same words he used with me, called another woman a typical project resident before dismissing her case." "Exactly," Olivia nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We've got him, Jada. These aren't just numbers. They're proof of systematic discrimination." The legal team Olivia had assembled worked at nearby tables, highlighting relevant passages and organizing evidence. The office buzzed with purposeful energy as they built their case. "Now," Olivia said, pulling out a fresh legal pad, "we need to prepare you. You're going to be crucial in presenting this evidence." Jada's stomach tightened. "Me? But I'm not a lawyer." "No, but you're the voice of everyone who's been silenced by Pembroke. Your experience matters." Olivia stood up and walked to a whiteboard. "Let's practice. Tell me how you'd present this evidence to the Judicial Review Board." Over the next few hours, Olivia coached Jada through the presentation. They worked on her delivery, her confidence, and her ability to connect the evidence to her personal experience. When Jada stumbled, Olivia encouraged her to try again. "Remember," Olivia said, "you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for Mrs. Johnson, who lost her home of 30 years, for the Robinson family who were evicted while their appeal was still pending, for everyone in these files who never got a fair hearing. Civil rights lawyers began arriving for their strategy meeting. Jada watched as they filled the conference room, their expressions serious but determined. Representatives from housing rights organizations and community advocacy groups joined them. "Ready?" Olivia asked, gathering their materials. Jada stood up, smoothing her borrowed blazer. The evidence was organized in her folder, each page telling part of the story of Pembroke's prejudice. She thought of her father, still sick at home, of her mother working double shifts, of all the families in those case files. Looking around at the assembled group of legal professionals, Jada felt her nervousness transform into determination. These people were here to help, to fight alongside her and Olivia. She gripped her folder tightly and nodded. "I'm ready," she said, stepping toward the conference room where she would present their findings. Olivia's hand rested supportively on her shoulder as they walked in together. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room made Jada's eyes ache as she sat, phone clutched in her trembling hands. Just hours ago, she'd received the call that Olivia had collapsed and been rushed to the emergency room. Now, watching doctors hurry past without any updates, Jada felt more alone than ever. "Please be okay," she whispered, remembering all the times Olivia's steady voice had guided her through difficult moments. Over the next few days, Jada tried to keep the case moving forward, but everything seemed to fall apart without Olivia's expertise. The legal team that had once been so passionate now appeared hesitant and uncertain. Phone calls went unreturned and meetings were postponed. "We need to reassess our strategy," one lawyer told her, avoiding eye contact, without Olivia's connections and experience. The words hung in the air, unfinished but clear. Without Olivia, they were losing momentum. Judge Pembroke wasted no time taking advantage of the situation. His smug face appeared on local news channels, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the allegations against him. These groundless accusations were clearly orchestrated by someone with an agenda, he declared confidently. Now that their ringleader is indisposed, perhaps we can put this unfortunate circus behind us. Jada watched the interview from her bedroom, tears of frustration burning in her eyes. The evidence they'd gathered seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Without Olivia's guidance, she didn't know how to keep the pressure on Pembroke or maintain the media's interest in their cause. At school, the whispers started again. "Told you she couldn't handle it," she heard someone say as she passed in the hallway. "Just another project kid trying to play lawyer." The doubt crept in like a shadow, growing larger with each passing day. Jada spent hours staring at the case files, trying to make sense of the legal terminology that had seemed so clear when Olivia explained it. But now the words blurred together and the task felt impossible. Walking through the city streets after another disappointing meeting with the legal team, Jada felt the full weight of her situation crushing down on her. The tall buildings seemed to loom over her, as imposing as the obstacles she faced. Every step felt heavy, like her feet were made of lead. She stopped at a crosswalk, watching the traffic flow past. The same corner where she and Olivia had often grabbed coffee while discussing strategy now just reminded her of everything she'd lost. The mentor who had become like family, the confidence she'd built, the hope she'd held on to. It all seemed to be slipping away. Looking up at the evening sky, Jada felt more lost than she had in weeks. The stars were barely visible through the city lights, just like her path forward seemed hidden in darkness. Without Olivia's wisdom and strength to guide her, she wondered if she'd been foolish to think she could take on someone as powerful as Judge Pembroke. Deep within her chest, something stirred, a tiny spark of determination that refused to be extinguished completely. But standing alone on that busy street corner, even that small flame felt dangerously close to going out. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the silence as Jada sat beside Olivia's bed. Her mentor's usually vibrant presence was diminished, replaced by the quiet stillness of illness. Jada's textbooks lay unopened in her backpack. She couldn't focus on schoolwork, not with everything falling apart. "I don't know if I can do this without you," Jada whispered, her voice catching. She watched Olivia's chest rise and fall with each breath, remembering how strong and certain she had seemed in the courthouse that first day. The legal papers were piling up on her kitchen table at home. Every morning, more news articles appeared questioning their case against Judge Pembroke. Without Olivia's guidance, Jada felt lost in the maze of legal terminology and procedures. The confidence she'd built over the past weeks was crumbling. "Miss Williams?" A nurse poked her head in. "Visiting hours are almost over." Jada nodded numbly, gathering her things. As she stood to leave, doubt crashed over her like a wave. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she was just a foolish kid taking on something way too big. The next few days blurred together in a haze of hospital visits and mounting pressure. The legal team's calls went unanswered as Jada struggled to keep up. Judge Pembroke's smug face appeared on the evening news, dismissing their case as baseless accusations from an attention-seeking child. Sitting in the hospital room on the fourth day, Jada finally broke down. "I can't do this," she whispered, wiping away tears. "It's too much. I'm sorry, Olivia." Just then, she felt a weak squeeze on her hand. Her head snapped up to see Olivia's eyes open, tired but alert. "Jada?" Olivia's voice was barely above a whisper, but it held the same strength Jada remembered. "Promise me something." "Anything," Jada leaned forward eagerly. "Promise me you won't give up." Olivia's gaze was intense despite her weakness. "Promise me you'll keep fighting." Jada's throat tightened with emotion. "But I don't know how without you." "You do know how," Olivia insisted. "Everything you need is already inside you. Promise me." Tears rolled down Jada's cheeks as she nodded. "I promise." The moment was brief. Olivia's eyes soon closed again as exhaustion took over. But something had shifted inside Jada. Standing outside the hospital in the cool evening air, she pulled out her phone and dialed Olivia's number. When the voicemail clicked on, she spoke with renewed determination. "I promise I won't let you down," she said firmly. "I'm going to keep fighting, for both of us." Jada sat at her small desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents. The lamp cast a warm glow over her work as she methodically reviewed each piece of evidence they had gathered against Judge Pembroke. Her fingers traced over Olivia's neat handwriting in the margins, remembering her mentor's words. "When you're in the fight for justice, you can't stop fighting." The words gave her strength as she organized the files into neat piles. One stack showed Pembroke's pattern of dismissing cases from black plaintiffs. Another contained testimonies from people who had faced his prejudice in court. Each document told a story of injustice that couldn't be ignored. "Mom?" Jada called out, her voice steady. "Can you help me with something?" Her mother appeared in the doorway, looking tired but determined. Together, they created a timeline of Pembroke's most controversial rulings. The pattern was clear. Case after case showed his bias against people of color. The next morning, Jada began reaching out to legal activists who had fought similar battles. She found contact information for civil rights organizations and sent carefully worded emails explaining her situation. To her surprise, responses started coming in quickly. "We've been watching your case," one activist wrote. "Judge Pembroke's behavior has been concerning for years." Another message came from a lawyer who had successfully removed a biased judge in another state. "I can share our strategy with you," they offered. "What you're doing is important." Jada created spreadsheets tracking similar cases across the country. She studied the successful attempts to remove prejudiced judges, noting the common factors that led to their removal. With each piece of research, her confidence grew stronger. In her bedroom, Jada pinned articles and documents to a large corkboard. Red string connected related cases, creating a visual web of Pembroke's discriminatory behavior. She added sticky notes with important dates and quotes, building a clear picture of the judge's pattern of bias. "This isn't just about me anymore," Jada whispered to herself as she reviewed her work. "This is about everyone he's hurt." She spent hours organizing the evidence into clear, compelling presentations. Each document was carefully labeled and copied, ready to be shared with the media when the time was right. Her desk became command central, with folders labeled by date and importance. The work was exhausting but energizing. Every new piece of evidence felt like a step closer to justice. As she stood back and looked at everything she had gathered, Jada felt something shift inside her. The fear and doubt that had plagued her during Olivia's hospitalization began to fade, replaced by a steady determination. At her desk, surrounded by the proof of Pembroke's prejudice, Jada allowed herself a small smile. The evidence was there, clear as day. She had what she needed to move forward. The next phase of the fight was about to begin. Jada's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she put the finishing touches on her online petition. Her heart raced as she reviewed the carefully crafted words one last time. The evidence against Judge Pembroke was laid out clearly. His pattern of discriminatory rulings, the unfair treatment of black plaintiffs, and her own personal experience with his prejudice. "This has to work," she whispered to herself as she clicked the submit button. Within the first hour, the petition gained 50 signatures. By lunch, it had reached 500. Jada refreshed the page constantly, watching the numbers climb. Each new signature felt like a small victory, a voice joining her fight. Her phone buzzed with notifications as people began sharing her story across social media platforms. Comments poured in from others who had faced similar discrimination in Pembroke's courtroom. Legal professionals started reaching out, offering their expertise and support. "Your courage in speaking out is inspiring," wrote one civil rights attorney. "We've been watching Judge Pembroke's conduct for years." The media attention came next. Local news stations picked up the story first, then national outlets. Jada found herself sitting for interviews, telling her story again and again. Each time she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more confident. "What made you decide to take action?" a reporter asked during one interview. "Because someone had to," Jada replied, thinking of Olivia. "Someone had to stand up and say this isn't right." The petition numbers continued to climb. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Each signature represented someone who believed in her cause, who demanded justice. Legal experts began appearing on news shows, discussing Pembroke's history of biased rulings. The evidence Jada had gathered became talking points in debates about judicial accountability. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting her cause. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination in the legal system. What had started as one girl's fight for her family's home had become a rallying cry for justice. In her room, Jada watched as another 1,000 signatures rolled in. Her phone lit up with messages of support from across the country. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering to join her cause. Legal professionals volunteered their services. "This is bigger than me now," she said softly, watching the numbers climb. The petition had become a movement, a demand for change that couldn't be ignored. The spotlight on Judge Pembroke grew brighter with each passing hour, as more people joined the call for accountability. She opened her laptop to find hundreds of new emails, journalists requesting interviews, activists offering support, and ordinary people sharing their stories. The momentum felt unstoppable. For the first time since starting this fight, Jada felt the full power of collective action. Sitting at her desk, watching the petition numbers rise, Jada felt a mix of awe and determination. The movement she'd started was growing beyond anything she'd imagined. This wasn't just about her family's eviction anymore. It had become a fight to expose a corrupt system that had hurt countless others. The bright studio lights felt warm on Jada's face as she sat before the television cameras. Her hands were steady now, unlike the trembling fingers that had held that first eviction notice months ago. Beside her sat two prominent civil rights attorneys, their presence lending weight to the growing movement she had sparked. "Ms. Williams," the host began, "your petition has gathered over 50,000 signatures. Did you expect this level of response?" Jada leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just about me anymore. Every signature represents someone who has faced injustice in our courts. Judge Pembroke's behavior is just one example of a much bigger problem." The civil rights attorney to her left nodded. "What we're seeing here is systematic. Our investigation into Judge Pembroke's record shows a clear pattern of discriminatory rulings that spans decades." As they discussed the statistics, the disproportionate eviction rates, the dismissal of valid claims, the documented instances of judicial misconduct, Jada could feel the momentum building. The host's questions grew more pointed, more focused on the need for immediate action. Back in her hospital room, Olivia watched the broadcast with tears in her eyes. Though still weak, she managed to send Jada a text. "You're doing it, baby girl. Keep going." The pressure mounted as more legal professionals stepped forward. 3 retired judges issued a joint statement condemning Pembroke's conduct. Law professors from prestigious universities began citing Jada's case in their discussions of judicial reform. Then came the announcement that shook the legal community. The Judicial Conduct Board would reopen its investigation into Pembroke's conduct. The statement was dry and official, but its implications were enormous. "We take allegations of judicial misconduct seriously," the board's spokesperson announced on national television. "Given the new evidence that has come to light, we believe a thorough investigation is warranted." Jada sat in the green room after the panel, surrounded by legal experts who were now allies in her fight. Their phones buzzed constantly with updates and messages of support. Major news networks were picking up the story, and social media was ablaze with calls for justice. "This is what change looks like," one of the attorneys told her, squeezing her shoulder. "It starts with one voice brave enough to speak up." Jada watched as breaking news banners scrolled across the television screen. "Judge under investigation. Allegations of systemic bias force judicial review." Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. The system that had once seemed immovable was finally being forced to look at itself in the mirror. The buzz of her phone interrupted her thoughts, another message from Olivia. "Remember what I told you? The truth always finds its way to the light." The courtroom doors felt heavier than ever as Jada pushed them open. The familiar wood panels and stern faces that had once intimidated her now seemed different. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. At the defendant's table sat Judge Walter Pembroke, his usual arrogant demeanor replaced by something she'd never seen before: uncertainty. Jada smoothed her navy suit jacket, a gift from Olivia, who was watching from her wheelchair in the gallery. This suit fit perfectly, unlike the borrowed one from her first appearance. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She had grown into this role, just as she had grown into this fight. "All rise," the clerk announced as the presiding judge entered the courtroom. Jada's legal team surrounded her with stacks of evidence, testimonies, statistical analyses, and documented patterns of bias spanning decades. Each paper represented a family like hers, a story of injustice that had gone unchallenged for too long. When it was her turn to speak, Jada approached the podium. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, what we present today isn't just about one case or one family. This is about a pattern of discrimination that has affected countless lives." She gestured to the gallery, where families who had suffered similar fates sat watching. Behind every dismissal, behind every rushed judgment, there are real people. Children who lost their homes, families torn apart, communities destroyed. Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Jada's team presented their evidence. Charts showed the stark disparities in his rulings based on race. Testimonies from other judges and legal experts highlighted his pattern of bias. Former clerks spoke about his discriminatory comments behind closed doors. When Pembroke finally rose to defend himself, his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "These accusations are ridiculous," he sputtered, his face reddening. "My rulings have always been based on the law, nothing more." But as he spoke, his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence before him. He fumbled through explanations, tried to dismiss statistical proof as coincidence, but his usual tactics of intimidation fell flat. Jada stood for her final statement, looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, this court represents justice, but justice cannot exist alongside prejudice. Judge Pembroke's actions have shown that he cannot separate his personal biases from his duty to the law." The courtroom fell silent as she finished speaking. She could feel all eyes on her, the families in the gallery, the legal team beside her, and Pembroke himself, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his exposed prejudices. The silence stretched on as the presiding judge reviewed the evidence before him. Jada remained standing, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. This moment represented everything she had fought for, not just for her family, but for every person who had faced injustice in Pembroke's courtroom. The marble hallway outside the courtroom felt endless as Jada paced back and forth. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of how far she'd come. The polished wooden benches lining the walls held a mix of reporters, activists, and concerned citizens, all waiting for the verdict that could change everything. Olivia sat quietly in her wheelchair, her presence a steady anchor despite her weakened state. Her eyes followed Jada's movement with quiet pride, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Though still recovering, she had insisted on being here for this moment. "You've done everything you could," Olivia said softly, her voice carrying across the hushed hallway. "Whatever happens now, you've shown them the truth." Jada nodded, trying to steady her breathing. Camera crews huddled near the courtroom doors, their equipment ready to capture the historic moment. Social media was buzzing with updates, and #JusticeForJada had been trending all morning. The heavy doors creaked open and a court officer emerged. "All parties, please return to the courtroom," he announced. Jada's legs felt like lead as she walked back inside. The familiar room now held a different energy, tense, expectant, electric. Judge Pembroke sat at the defendant's table, his usual swagger replaced by rigid posture and tight lips. The presiding judge entered and everyone rose. Jada could hear her pulse in her ears as the judge began to speak. The words seemed to echo through the silent room. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this court finds Judge Walter Pembroke guilty of multiple counts of judicial misconduct." Jada's breath caught in her throat, including documented patterns of racial bias and unethical behavior in violation of judicial standards. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "Therefore, effective immediately, Judge Walter Pembroke is hereby removed from the bench and stripped of his judicial authority." The room erupted. Gasps and exclamations filled the air, followed by applause that the court officers struggled to quiet. Pembroke's face drained of color as he stared straight ahead, his world crumbling around him. Jada stood still, barely breathing. She watched as Pembroke's shoulders slumped, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. The man who had once dismissed her so cruelly, who had wielded his power like a weapon, now looked small and defeated. Olivia reached over and squeezed Jada's hand. Tears streamed down both their faces, tears of relief, of vindication, of justice, finally served. The media rushed to capture every moment. Camera flashes lit up the room as reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Through it all, Jada remained rooted to her spot, watching as Pembroke gathered his things with trembling hands. In the courthouse lobby, surrounded by the buzz of victory, Jada felt something settle in her chest, a deep, profound peace. She looked at the towering pillars of justice that had once seemed so intimidating, and for the first time they felt like they truly stood for what they were meant to represent. The small living room of their apartment buzzed with energy as Jada sat surrounded by her family. Her mother perched on the edge of the worn armchair, hands clasped tightly in her lap, while her younger siblings crowded onto the couch. Outside, reporters waited eagerly for a chance to speak with the girl who had taken down Judge Pembroke. "I still can't believe it," her mother whispered, shaking her head in amazement. "My baby girl did all this." Jada smiled, though exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. The constant ringing of her phone had become both exciting and overwhelming. Every news outlet wanted to hear her story, to understand how a young black girl had managed to expose such deeply rooted corruption in the legal system. "Tell us again about the moment they announced the verdict," her youngest sister begged, bouncing slightly on the couch cushions. Before Jada could respond, another call lit up her phone. This time, it was from a civil rights activist who had been following her case. "Your courage has inspired so many people," the activist told her. "You've shown them that one voice can make a difference." The words felt heavy with responsibility. Jada thanked the caller politely, but as she hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just her victory over Pembroke. The system that had allowed him to abuse his power for so long still existed. Other judges like him still sat on benches across the country, making biased decisions that destroyed lives. Her mother must have noticed her expression because she reached over and squeezed Jada's hand. "You look tired, baby." "It's a lot," Jada admitted. Everyone wants to talk about the case, about what it means. And I know it's important, but it's overwhelming, her mother finished for her. Another call came through, this time from a legal professional who wanted to discuss the implications of the case for judicial reform. Jada let it go to voicemail, needing a moment to breathe. Her siblings watched her with a mixture of pride and curiosity. They had seen their sister transform from a scared girl facing eviction to someone who had changed the system itself. The media called her a hero, but to them, she was still just Jada, their sister who had refused to back down when faced with injustice. "Ms. Williams," came a shout from outside their window. "Can we get a statement about Judge Pembroke's removal?" Jada moved to the window, gazing out at the gathering of reporters below. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the city streets. She felt the weight of everything she had accomplished, but also the responsibility that came with it. This victory wasn't just about her family anymore. It had become a symbol of hope for others fighting similar battles. She stepped back from the window, turning to face her family. Their faces reflected both pride and concern. Pride in what she had achieved, but concern about the spotlight now focused so intensely on their lives. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as students filed into their seats in their blue graduation gowns. Jada smoothed down her own gown, her heart racing with anticipation. Through the crowd, she spotted her family, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her father sitting up straight despite his illness, and her siblings practically bouncing in their seats with excitement. In the front row, Olivia Morgan sat tall and dignified, though her recent illness had left its mark. She caught Jada's eye and gave her a small, knowing nod that made Jada's chest swell with emotion. "Williams, Jada," the principal called out. Jada rose from her seat, walking across the stage with measured steps. The spotlight felt warm on her face as she reached for her diploma. The certificate felt light in her hands, but the weight of what it represented made her pause for just a moment. As she made her way back to her seat, memories of the past year washed over her. She remembered standing in that courtroom, terrified but determined. She thought of the eviction notice that had started it all, the crushing weight of responsibility on her young shoulders. The humiliation she'd felt when Judge Pembroke had dismissed her so cruelly still stung, but it had transformed into something powerful. The battle for justice had taken everything from her, her peace of mind, her sense of security, countless hours of sleep. Yet it had given her so much more. Strength she never knew she had, a voice she'd never dared to use, and a purpose that burned bright and clear. From her seat, she could see Olivia watching her, the woman who had stepped forward when no one else would, who had shown her that one person's voice could change the world. Despite her ongoing recovery, Olivia's eyes shone with fierce pride. Jada sat tall in her chair, feeling the magnitude of the moment. Her diploma rested in her lap, not just a piece of paper, but a symbol of perseverance through it all. She had fought for justice while keeping up with her studies, had faced down a corrupt judge while preparing for exams, had sparked a movement while writing essays. Her family beamed from their seats, her mother's tears now flowing freely, her father's tired face lit up with joy, her siblings practically vibrating with excitement. They had weathered this storm together, had stood strong when the world tried to knock them down. The sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the edge of her diploma, making it gleam. Jada touched it gently, feeling the smooth surface under her fingers. This moment, this achievement, felt like both an ending and a beginning. Jada's hands trembled as she held the thick envelope from Harvard Law School. The morning sun streamed through her apartment window, casting a warm glow on the official letterhead. Her heart pounded as she read the words again. "We are pleased to offer you admission, full scholarship." "Mom!" she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Mom, come quick!" Her mother rushed in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, baby?" "I got in," Jada whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Full scholarship to Harvard Law." Her mother's eyes widened and she pulled Jada into a tight embrace. "Oh, my baby girl, I knew you could do it." They swayed together, both crying tears of joy. From his bedroom, Jada's father called out, "What's all the commotion about?" "Our daughter's going to Harvard Law," her mother announced, her voice filled with pride. Jada sat on the edge of her bed later that evening, running her fingers over the acceptance letter. The journey that had started with an eviction notice had led her here. She thought about that first day in court, facing Judge Pembroke's cruel dismissal. The memory still stung, but it no longer had power over her. She picked up her phone and dialed Olivia's number. As it rang, she remembered all the late nights spent studying for the LSAT, all the practice essays Olivia had reviewed with her, even from her hospital bed. "Hello?" Olivia's warm voice answered. "I got in," Jada said softly. "Full scholarship." "Oh, Jada." Olivia's voice was thick with emotion. "I never doubted you for a moment." Jada looked around her small bedroom, at the law books already piling up on her desk. The fight against Pembroke had shown her exactly what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to be there for other families facing injustice, to stand up against the system that tried to silence them. "I couldn't have done this without you," Jada told Olivia. "No, sweetheart, you did this. You took that first step into that courtroom. You stood up when everyone told you to sit down. I just helped you find your voice. You're the one who used it." Jada smiled, touching the acceptance letter again. In a few months, she would be walking through the halls of Harvard Law School. The thought filled her with both excitement and nervousness. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The coursework would be demanding, the pressure intense. But she was ready. Her mother knocked softly on the door, carrying a cup of hot chocolate. "Still taking it all in?" Jada nodded, making space for her mother to sit beside her. "It feels surreal." "You know what I see when I look at you?" her mother asked, handing her the mug. "I see a fighter. I see someone who's going to change things for people like us." Jada took a sip of the hot chocolate, letting its warmth spread through her. She thought about all the other families out there, facing the same battles she had faced. Soon, she would have the tools to help them. Soon, she would be able to stand up in court, not as a scared teenager, but as a lawyer ready to fight for justice. Jada sat cross-legged on her narrow dorm room bed, the evening light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Through her window, she could see the Boston skyline, a maze of buildings and twinkling lights that still felt surreal. Her fingers traced the edge of the silver picture frame she held, a snapshot from her high school graduation. In it, she stood tall beside Olivia, both of them beaming with pride. "You were always meant to be here," Olivia had told her that day, and now those words echoed in Jada's mind as she looked around her small but tidy dorm room. Her law textbooks were stacked neatly on her desk, post-it notes marking important passages she needed to review. The first few weeks of law school had been intense. Every morning, Jada woke up early to prepare for classes, often being one of the first students in the lecture hall. She couldn't help but notice that she was one of only 3 black students in her class of 90. The pressure to excel, to prove herself worthy of her place here, weighed heavily on her shoulders. Last night, during their weekly phone call, Olivia had sensed Jada's exhaustion. "Remember why you're there," she'd said, her voice warm and steady through the phone. "Every case you study, every principle you learn, it's all ammunition for the battles ahead." Jada set the photo on her nightstand and pulled out her constitutional law textbook. The margins were already filled with her neat handwriting, questions and connections she'd made during lectures. Her professor had praised her insights yesterday, noting how she'd drawn parallels between historical civil rights cases and modern-day injustices. "You're not just here to learn the law," Olivia had reminded her. "You're here to learn how to change it." A text message lit up her phone, another encouraging note from Olivia. "Thinking of you. Keep pushing forward." Jada smiled, feeling the familiar surge of determination that always followed Olivia's words. She walked to her window, watching students hurry across the campus below. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves scattered across the paths in shades of red and gold. In these quiet moments, Jada felt both the weight and the privilege of her position. She thought about her family back home, about all the people who, like her, had faced injustice but hadn't had the opportunity to fight back. Her phone buzzed again. A a reminder about tomorrow's study group. She was the only black student in the group, and sometimes she felt the pressure to represent her entire community in their discussions. But she remembered what Olivia had taught her about turning that pressure into purpose. Standing at the window, Jada watched the city lights begin to twinkle in the growing darkness. The view reminded her of all those late nights spent preparing her case against Judge Pembroke, of the countless hours Olivia had spent mentoring her, believing in her even when she doubted herself. The city sprawled before her, full of promise and challenge. She was ready for both. Tomorrow would bring another day of intense studying, of raising her hand even when her heart raced, of speaking up even when her voice wanted to shake. But tonight, in this quiet moment, she felt the strength of everyone who had helped her get here, especially Olivia, whose wisdom and guidance had shaped her path forward. Jada's heels clicked against the polished marble floor of Anderson and Mitchell Law, where she now worked as a senior civil rights attorney. The prestigious firm's hallways gleamed with success. Awards, accolades, and photographs of landmark cases lined the walls. But one particular image made her pause every time she passed it. There she was, younger and less polished, standing next to Olivia outside the courthouse after Judge Pembroke's removal. The determination in both their eyes still burned bright through the glass. Jada reached out, her fingers hovering over Olivia's face in the photograph. "Ms. Williams?" Her assistant's voice broke through her reverie. "The team is waiting in the conference room for the briefing on the Thompson case." Jada nodded, straightening her suit jacket. The Thompson case represented everything she'd been fighting for since that day in Pembroke's courtroom. It was a class action lawsuit against 3 judges who had systematically discriminated against minority defendants, affecting thousands of lives over decades. In the conference room, junior attorneys sat ready with their notepads. They looked at her with the same admiration she once had for Olivia. Jada remembered how it felt to be on the other side, to be the one fighting against seemingly insurmountable odds. "This case," she began, her voice steady and clear, "isn't just about legal precedent. It's about real people whose lives have been derailed by prejudice disguised as justice." As she outlined the strategy, Jada felt Olivia's presence in every word she spoke. The lessons her mentor had taught her were woven into the fabric of her legal approach. The importance of thorough preparation, the power of speaking truth to power, and the unwavering commitment to justice. Her reputation preceded her now. The lawyer who took down Pembroke, that's what they called her in legal circles. But Jada knew she was more than that single victory. She was part of a continuing legacy, a torchbearer for the next generation of civil rights attorneys. The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows as Jada concluded the briefing. Her team was energized, ready to tackle the mountain of work ahead. As they filed out, Jada remained at the head of the table looking down at her case notes. On the corner of her legal pad, she'd sketched a small symbol, the scales of justice. It was something Olivia used to draw when they worked together. Now Jada found herself doing the same thing unconsciously, a reminder of where she came from and why she fought so hard. She gathered her papers and walked toward the courtroom where she would present their initial arguments. Each step echoed with purpose. She wasn't just Jada Williams anymore. She was the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, the force that pushed back against systemic injustice, the legacy of every fighter for justice who came before her. The fluorescent light cast harsh shadows across Jada's law school textbooks as she sat at her cramped desk. Her eyes burned from hours of reading case law, and her shoulders ached from hunching over her notes. The clock on her wall showed 2 a.m., but sleep felt impossible with the weight of upcoming exams pressing down on her. Being one of the few black students in her class made every day feel like a test beyond academics. She could feel the eyes on her during discussions, the unspoken pressure to prove she belonged there. The whispers still followed her. Some students knew her as the girl who took down Judge Pembroke, and those expectations felt suffocating. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Hope you're getting some rest, baby. Don't forget to eat." Jada's heart clenched. Her family was struggling to make ends meet, even with her scholarship. Her father's medical bills kept piling up, and she couldn't help but wonder if she should have taken a job instead of pursuing law school. The The constitutional law textbook stared back at her, filled with complex theories that seemed to blur together. Her latest quiz scores weren't what she'd hoped for, and doubt crept in like a shadow. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this. Maybe her victory against Pembroke had been luck rather than skill. Desperate for connection, Jada reached out to her study group. Sarah, a fellow first-year student, responded immediately. "You're not alone in this. Want to grab coffee tomorrow and go over the readings together?" More messages followed. Marcus offered his outline from last semester's civil procedure class. Lisa suggested they form a regular study group. Their support, though simple, felt like a lifeline. During one late-night study session, Lisa confessed her own struggles with imposter syndrome. Marcus shared stories about working 2 jobs to afford his textbooks. Their honesty helped Jada open up about her own fears. In those moments of vulnerability, Olivia's words echoed in her mind. "You've always been meant for this." The memory of her mentor's unwavering belief gave her strength. Jada began to see her challenges not as obstacles but as stepping stones, each difficulty preparing her for the battles ahead. With her study group support, Jada developed new strategies for tackling her coursework. They created flashcards, shared notes, and quizzed each other until concepts became clearer. The material was still challenging, but facing it together made it manageable. Sitting cross-legged on her bed, Jada looked at the framed photo of Olivia on her nightstand. The weight of law school hadn't lifted, but something had shifted inside her. She remembered the courthouse steps, the day they'd won against Pembroke. That victory hadn't come easily either, but it had come through persistence and courage. She traced her finger over Olivia's image, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was difficult, but she wasn't walking it alone. Her classmates' support, Olivia's wisdom, and her own determination would carry her forward. She had fought too hard to give up now. Professor Anita Walker's office felt different from the sterile, intimidating spaces that filled the law school building. Warm sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating shelves lined with civil rights law books and framed newspaper clippings of landmark cases. Jada sat in a worn leather chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as Professor Walker reviewed her latest paper. "You have a unique perspective, Jada," Professor Walker said, looking up from the pages with keen interest. "Your analysis of systemic discrimination in housing law shows real insight. It reminds me of cases I worked on early in my career." Jada felt her cheeks warm at the praise. Professor Walker was a legend in civil rights law, known for taking on impossible cases and winning them. Her presence commanded respect, yet there was a gentleness in her eyes that reminded Jada of Olivia. "I want to mentor you," Professor Walker continued, leaning forward. "I see the fire in you, the determination to make real change. But I also see the weight you're carrying, trying to navigate this profession as a Black woman." Over the next few months, Professor Walker's guidance transformed Jada's law school experience. They met weekly, discussing cases and strategy, but also the unwritten rules and barriers that existed in the legal world. Professor Walker shared her own stories of facing discrimination, of being underestimated and overlooked, and how she turned those challenges into fuel for her fight for justice. "Never let them make you doubt your voice," Professor Walker advised during one session. "Your experiences, your perspective, they're not weaknesses, they're your strength." Under Professor Walker's mentorship, Jada began working at the law school's civil rights clinic. Together, they took on cases that echoed the injustices Jada had witnessed firsthand. Each case was a chance to put their discussions into practice, to use the law as a tool for change. "Remember," Professor Walker would say as they prepared for hearings, "the law is meant to serve justice. When it fails to do that, it's our job to push it in the right direction." In Professor Walker's office, surrounded by the history of civil rights victories and the promise of battles yet to come, Jada felt her confidence growing. She was learning not just the letter of the law, but how to wield it effectively, how to stand tall in rooms designed to make her feel small. Now, as they stood together in the law school clinic, preparing to take on their first major case as mentor and mentee, Jada felt ready. Professor Walker adjusted her suit jacket, a gesture Jada had come to recognize as her preparation for battle. "Are you ready?" Professor Walker asked, her eyes bright with determination. Jada nodded, feeling the familiar fire of justice burning in her chest. With Professor Walker beside her, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. Jada stared at the pristine letterhead from Morrison and Blake Law, her fingers tracing the embossed logo. The summer internship offer felt heavy in her hands. Not just paper, but the weight of a decision that could shape her entire career. The firm was known for its corporate success and influential connections, but whispers about their treatment of minority employees circulated through campus hallways. She thought about her family back home, how proud they'd be to see her at such a prestigious firm. The salary would help with bills, and the name on her resume could open doors. But something didn't sit right in her stomach. Picking up her phone, she dialed Professor Walker's number. Within an hour, she sat in the familiar comfort of her mentor's office. "They have a terrible track record with diversity," Jada explained, clutching her coffee cup. "But everyone says I'd be crazy to turn this down." Professor Walker leaned back in her chair, studying Jada carefully. "Change can come from within, Jada. Sometimes we need people willing to be the first to break down those barriers." "But at what cost?" Jada asked, her voice quiet. "I've seen what happens when people compromise their values for success. I watched Judge Pembroke destroy lives because no one stood up to him." "Then you already know your answer," Professor Walker replied gently. That evening, Jada sat at her desk drafting her response to Morrison and Blake. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed, but her heart felt steady. She declined their offer, explaining professionally but firmly that their values didn't align with her career goals. As she hit send, memories of her fight against Pembroke flooded back. She remembered Olivia's unwavering support, the courage it took to stand up against injustice. Taking this internship would mean betraying everything she'd fought for. Instead of the prestigious firm's office, Jada would spend her summer working with Professor Walker on civil rights cases. The pay would be lower, the hours longer, but she knew in her heart it was right. Walking out of Morrison and Blake's towering office building after delivering her decision in person, Jada felt lighter. The sun warmed her face as she stepped onto the busy street, and for the first time in weeks she smiled. The path ahead might be harder, but she was exactly where she needed to be. Jada stood in the mock courtroom, her heart pounding against her crisp white blouse. The familiar smell of polished wood and leather chairs reminded her of that first day she faced Judge Pembroke. But this time was different. She was different. Her client's case file lay open before her. A young black woman named Tanya accused of theft despite clear evidence of her innocence. Though this was just a mock trial, Jada felt the weight of representation heavy on her shoulders. "All rise," called out the student clerk. The mock judge entered, and Jada straightened her spine, remembering Olivia's words about carrying herself with dignity no matter what. Her opponent, James Richardson, stood at the other table with an air of confidence that came from 3 generations of lawyers in his family. He'd made it clear during their trial prep that he saw this as an easy win. As the trial began, James presented his case with practiced precision. His words were sharp, his arguments well-crafted. Jada felt her hands trembling slightly as she rose for her first cross-examination. "Objection leading the witness," James called out when Jada began questioning his key witness. For a moment, Jada froze. The room seemed to spin slightly, but then she heard Professor Walker's voice in her head. "Remember your foundations. Trust your preparation." "Your Honor," Jada responded, her voice growing stronger. "I'm establishing the witness's bias. It goes to credibility." The judge nodded and Jada continued, finding her rhythm. With each question, her confidence grew. She remembered how Olivia had taught her to look for the truth beneath the surface, to question everything that didn't add up. During her closing argument, Jada stood tall. She didn't just recite facts. She told Tanya's story. She spoke about presumption of guilt, about how quick people were to believe the worst about a young black woman shopping in an upscale store. "The prosecution wants you to see what they saw," Jada said, her voice clear and strong. "A black woman in the wrong place. But what the evidence shows is something entirely different. It shows a hard-working student who saved for months to buy a gift for her mother. The security footage shows her at the register, receipt in hand. The prosecution's case isn't built on facts, it's built on prejudice. James tried to object to throw her off balance, but Jada held firm. She could feel Professor Walker watching from the back of the room, could almost see Olivia's proud smile. This wasn't just about winning a mock trial. It was about proving she belonged here, that she could fight for justice within the system. As she delivered her final words, Jada felt something shift inside her. The nervous law student had transformed into something more, an advocate ready to fight for truth and justice. The mock judge called for a brief recess to consider the arguments. Jada sat down, her heart still racing but her mind clear. Whatever the outcome, she knew she had given everything she had. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. In the matter of State versus Thompson, this court finds the defendant not guilty. Jada's breath caught in her throat. She had won. She had actually won. Jada stood backstage at the National Legal Reform Conference, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down her navy blue blazer. The conference hall buzzed with conversation. Judges, lawyers, and legal scholars from across the country filled the seats. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see Professor Walker sitting in the front row, offering an encouraging smile. Taking a deep breath, Jada pulled out her note cards. She'd practiced this speech countless times in front of her mirror, but standing here now, the weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just any speech. This was her chance to challenge the very system that had once tried to silence her. And now, please welcome Jada Williams, civil rights advocate and third-year law student. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Jada walked onto the stage, her heels clicking against the polished wood. The bright lights felt warm on her face as she approached the podium. Looking out at the sea of faces, she remembered Olivia's words. Your voice matters. Use it. When I was 17, Jada began, her voice clear and strong. I stood before a judge who saw nothing but the color of my skin and my zip code. He didn't see a young woman fighting for her family's home. He didn't see a student who'd spent weeks preparing her case. He saw what his prejudice wanted him to see. The room fell silent. Jada could feel hundreds of eyes fixed on her as she continued, sharing her story of fighting against Judge Pembroke and the system he represented. She spoke about the countless others who faced similar discrimination, but lacked the support she'd found in Olivia. The legal system isn't broken, she declared, her voice rising with passion. It's working exactly as it was designed to work, keeping power in the hands of the privileged few while marginalizing communities of color. But we have the power to change that. As she outlined specific steps for reform, heads nodded throughout the audience. Some people took notes, while others leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. Change doesn't come from comfortable conversations, Jada concluded. It comes from challenging the status quo, from speaking truth to power, from refusing to accept that this is just how things are. The time for change is now, and it starts with everyone in this room. The applause was immediate and thunderous. People rose to their feet, and Jada felt tears prick at her eyes as she saw Professor Walker beaming with pride. After leaving the stage, Jada was surrounded by conference attendees eager to speak with her. A prominent civil rights attorney praised her courage. The dean of a prestigious law school handed her his card, mentioning future speaking opportunities. A group of law students asked about starting an advocacy group at their school. Standing slightly apart from the crowd, Jada caught her breath. The nervous energy that had filled her earlier was replaced by a sense of purpose. She'd done more than deliver a speech. She'd started a conversation that couldn't be ignored. Professor Walker made her way through the crowd and squeezed Jada's hand. You did it, she whispered. You made them listen. Jada sat at her small desk in her dorm room, staring at the thick contract from Preston and Associates. The prestigious law firm's glossy letterhead seemed to mock her as she flipped through the pages again. Her eyes kept returning to the problematic clauses, restrictions on pro bono work, mandatory arbitration agreements, and limitations on her ability to take on civil rights cases. The salary figure made her breath catch. It was more money than her family had ever seen. With this job, she could help her parents, maybe even get them a better place to live. Her fingers traced over the number, but her heart felt heavy. Her phone buzzed. Another message from the firm's hiring partner asking about her decision. Jada closed her eyes, remembering all the cases she'd dreamed of taking on, all the people she'd hoped to help. She called Professor Walker, her voice tight with anxiety. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "This could change everything for my family." "Come to my office," Professor Walker said gently. "Let's talk about this." In Professor Walker's warm, book-lined office, Jada laid out the contract. Professor Walker listened intently as Jada explained her concerns about the restrictive clauses. "You know," Professor Walker said, leaning forward in her chair, "sometimes the hardest choices are between what looks good on paper and what feels right in your heart. What does your heart tell you about this?" Jada's voice wavered. "I keep thinking about that day in court with Judge Pembroke, about Olivia standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. These clauses, they'd stop me from helping people like me." Professor Walker nodded. "The path to real change isn't always the most comfortable one." "But the money," Jada started. "Will there be other opportunities?" Professor Walker asked. "Other ways to help your family while staying true to your mission?" Jada thought about it, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said firmly. "There will be." The next morning, Jada walked into Preston and Associates' gleaming office building. Her steps were sure as she rode the elevator to the top floor. The hiring partner's surprise was evident when she handed back the contract unsigned. "I appreciate the offer," Jada said, her voice steady, "but I need to stay true to why I chose this path in the first place." As she walked out of the building, the morning sun warm on her face, Jada felt lighter. The weight of the decision had lifted, replaced by a quiet certainty. She might have less money in her bank account, but her conscience was clear. Jada walked into her corner office at Williams Civil Rights Law, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow on the collection of framed photographs and awards that lined the walls. Each one told a story of victory, of justice served, of lives changed. But her eyes were drawn to one particular photograph, a simple snapshot taken years ago. In it, a young Jada stood clutching Olivia Morgan's business card, her face set with determination despite the tears that had threatened to fall that day. The memory was still vivid, standing in that courthouse, feeling lost and alone until Olivia stepped forward to change everything. Jada touched the frame gently, remembering Olivia's strength, her wisdom, her unwavering belief in justice. The lessons she'd learned from her mentor had shaped every case she'd taken on since then. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant handed her an envelope, the return address making her heart skip a beat. It was from Olivia's daughter. With trembling fingers, Jada opened it and pulled out a letter written in Olivia's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Jada," the letter began. "If you're reading this, I've moved on to my next great adventure. But before I go, I needed to tell you one last time what I've always known. You were always meant to change the world." Tears welled in Jada's eyes as she continued reading. The paper shook slightly in her hands. "I've watched you grow from that brave young girl in the courthouse to a powerful force for justice. Every case you've won, every life you've touched, every wrong you've made right. This is the legacy I always hoped to see. You've taken up the torch and carried it further than I ever could." Jada wiped her eyes, looking around at her office. The walls were covered with news clippings of her biggest cases: discriminatory housing practices exposed, corrupt judges removed, systemic racism challenged head-on. Each victory had brought her closer to fulfilling the promise she'd made to herself and to Olivia. Later that afternoon, Jada stood before a group of eager law students at her alma mater. Their faces reminded her of herself years ago, full of passion and determination to make a difference. She held up Olivia's letter, her voice strong and clear. "Someone very special once told me that the fight for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it," she began. "She taught me that one person's voice, raised in truth, can change everything." If you enjoyed the story of Jada, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.